Hi, welcome to Basics of Agritourism, Liability, and Your Legal Risks. I'm excited to present here today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Cari Rincker, and I am the owner of Rincker Law PLLC. We have offices both in New York and also in Champaign, Illinois. And very recently, within the last few months, I actually opened up a third office in my hometown of Shelbyville, Illinois. But I grew up in production agriculture. More specifically, I grew up on a beef cattle farm in central Illinois and have advanced degrees in animal science. I went to law school out on the East Coast to Pace University School of Law out in Westchester, New York, and I'm also the past chairperson of the American Bar Association General Practice Solo and Small Firm Divisions Agriculture Law Committee. My client base ranges from livestock producers to food entrepreneurs and even small to mid-size agribusinesses. So it's pretty diverse and also a national practice. Of course, like any good lawyer, I also have a disclaimer. So I am an attorney, but I am not necessarily your attorney. Today's presentation is for informational purposes only, and it should not be considered legal advice. Before making decisions for your farm or food business, it is always best to have a candid conversation with an attorney about your specific circumstances. All right, so today's presentation, I'm going to break up into three different segments. First and foremost, what is agritourism? And I'm only going to briefly touch on this segment because I know that most of the listeners here are already involved in one segment or another of agritourism. Number two, the risks with agritourism and how to mitigate those risks as well. So what is agritourism? In other words, sometimes known as agritainment. And that could be a wide variety of types of demonstrations, crop art, farm animal shows, acts, concerts, and festivals, and even more towards the agritainment side. It could include things like educational tours, pick your own, camps, schools, and even petting zoos. I've been getting a lot of phone calls lately on farm stays. I think this is a growing trend in production agriculture where there is a paid accommodation for the guest where he or she is actively engaged in the farm labor. So secondly, let's talk a little bit about the risks involved with agritourism. And there are several, which will lead very nicely to part 3 on mitigating that risk. But, you have public on your private property, especially children and the elderly, where there's higher risk for people falling or being somewhere on the property where they're not supposed to. People that do not understand some inherent risks involved in agriculture. So there's public safety concerns, there's even food safety concerns, and there are also some labor law issues as well. So keeping all that in mind, what are some things that those involved in agritourism can do to help mitigate that risk? So here are some legal mechanisms. One is looking at the choice of business entities. Second, insurance. Third, perhaps contractually, you should consider a general liability release, which will have a certain amount of power depending on which state you're in. Fourth, there are some contract maneuvers. And fifth, to think about some employment law issues, especially if you're dealing with some volunteer farm labor. Very briefly regarding the choice of business entity. So here's sort of the laundry list of some choices here. And the options do vary somewhat from state to state. So a sole proprietorship is just a one-man band, right? So it's one person. You can't have a sole proprietorship with 5 people. So that would be a partnership. In its simplest terms, a partnership is an agreement to share business profits or losses. And partnership can either be limited or a general partnership. And we'll talk about those differences in a minute. Corporations, and there's a lot of different kinds of corporations on how they're taxed, such as an S Corp, C Corp, and even a B Corp. And we'll delve into that. And sort of a hybrid business entity is this limited liability company. And different states have various spin-offs from that. And I'll mention that here in a minute, such as a series LLC or an L3C in some states. Rincker Law is a PLLC, a professional limited liability, but it all follows under the LLC umbrella. And then trust, a lot of people don't think about trust as a form of a business entity, but you can run a farm or an agribusiness in the shape of a trust. Next would be a cooperative, and finally a not-for-profit corporation. We're going to break them down one by one, but as a caveat to that, I do also want you to consider that you don't have to just have one business entity. Perhaps a mixture is the right choice for you. For example, maybe the land is owned by one LLC, and then the operating company is a second LLC, and a general partnership maybe between those two entities. I don't know. So we'll talk a little bit about those choices, but when we're going through this, I don't want you to think about, I only need to choose one, because perhaps if you're going to have educational tours on your farm or your agritourism operation, maybe there needs to be a separate not-for-profit corporation to handle that educational portion of your operation, whereas a partnership, corporation, or LLC is best for the other segments. An agriculture lawyer in Iowa by the name of Pat Dillon would always talk about these business entities with how people dress. And I am going to use that analogy because to me, it is very clear, and it shows sort of the differences in the style of the various types of entities. So to start off with the sole proprietorship, in terms of a dress code, this would be like a jeans and t-shirt. This is super cash, all right? It is informal. And again, it's formed with one person. There's a huge disadvantage, though, for this jeans and t-shirt guy or gal, is that there is an unlimited personal liability, okay? And, I've done estate planning for farms and ranches with $5 million of assets, and they're still running their operation under a sole proprietorship. So if this is you, and you are a sole proprietorship, you are not alone. But at the same time, you really need to think about if something goes wrong, especially with the increased risk of agritourism and agritainment. Are you creating that liability shield to protect your assets? A sole proprietorship, there's nothing. Sole proprietorship gets sued. Everything that you own could be subject to that lawsuit. So this is the default. If you have a business with one person who hasn't formed another entity, as an example, I was a cattle photographer way back in the day. Blackacre Photography was the name. I was a sole proprietorship, right? I was a DBA. I wasn't incorporated. And so that's sort of the default for an agritourism operation if there's no other entity. So there's no filing requirements. But if you are operating under a different name, an example that I have here on the slide is Farmer Jane DBA, Jane's Pumpkin Patch and Hay Rides, or my historic farm name was Rincker Cattle Co. So it was Cari Rincker DBA Rincker Cattle Co. And every state is a little bit different on their requirements for DBAs. A lot of states, including New York, says a certificate of assumed name, and it requires that you file the certificate with the county clerk. And I did just that. I literally filed my DBA for Rincker Cattle Company in New York County with the county clerks. I think I'm probably the only DBA there in the cattle sense. So I'm no longer a DBA. I have since incorporated my Rincker Cattle Company in Illinois. Importantly, if you are also operating under a sole proprietorship, you should, even though it's not required, to think about getting your own federal employer identification number. If a sole proprietorship does not obtain an FEIN, then if you are going to send, let's say, 1099s in January to people that work for you, then your Social Security number needs to be on that form. And an FEIN does not cost a penny. Your attorney can do it. Your banker can do it. Your accountant can do it. You can even do it. You just need to go to irs.gov. There's a link for applying to the federal employer identification number. You can only apply for one per day for those of you that are serial entrepreneurs like myself. So only one per day. And once you get that FEIN, you can get a separate business account. Even though it's not required to run your business with a separate business bank account, I really recommend it. I don't offer tax advice. I'm sure I should probably add that to my laundry list of disclaimers. No tax advice, but talk to your accountant, and I bet it will make their job a whole lot easier. Let's move on to partnerships. So, as I mentioned before, the standard definition of a partnership is when more than one person goes into business together to share profits. Not necessarily losses, but to share profits. And this can be formed inadvertently in agriculture. This is so common. I think my brother alone is involved in probably 19 different partnerships. At least it feels that way. I mean, if you go and talk to my brother and his cow herd, is like, oh, well, this is, these heifers are partnerships with dad, and then he's got a partnership, bull with somebody else. He's got a couple cows where he's partners with another guy, and they are forming effectively a general partnership because they have agreed to share profits on those animals. That's just one example in cattle, which seems to be ubiquitous there, but with agritourism, it could likewise be the same way. If somebody comes over with a farm stand, when you have a pumpkin patch and you have an agreement that you're going to share profits, that's a general partnership. You might not have it memorialized. You might not call it a general partnership, but it is. So there's two kinds of partnerships, as I previously noted. A general partnership, which is a default. And then the limited partnership is whenever you file something with not the county clerk, but the state. So the Department of State to form a limited partnership. So a general partnership, again, is when two or more people go into business together to share profits. And importantly, each partner is jointly and severally liable for the debts of the partnership, and there is no liability shield. So going back to that example of my brother with his partnership with, let's say, my dad, to keep things simple. So if my brother would, let's say, go and sell one of the partnership animals, he would have the ability to do that unless there is a partnership agreement that doesn't say that he can. Also, maybe my brother with the partnership with my father decides to buy really expensive cattle feed, and he buys, several months at one time. My father is jointly and severally liable for the debt of that partnership, even though my brother acted unilaterally. All right, that's the downside of a general partnership, especially if there is not a written general partnership agreement that says what partners can and cannot do. So it's a big caveat there with general partnerships, but like sole proprietorships, general partnerships can be, they happen a lot in agriculture. Importantly, the general partners themselves do not have to be individuals. They can be other entities. So going back to my very first slide on business entities, I talked about how you can have more than one, right? So it's possible that a not-for-profit corporation or a for-profit corporation in your farm business is a general partner or a limited partner with another type of business entity, okay? So I want you to think about that right now, that concept, and we can get to the why would you do that in a few minutes. All right, so in a limited partnership, an LP or an LLP, this is again a partnership with two or more people that have agreed to share profits. The major difference between a limited partnership and a general partnership is the word limited. So what does that mean? So there has to be a limited partner and a general partner. To back up to what a general partnership does is that there is an unlimited amount of personal liability on both of the partners. However, with a limited partnership, the limited partner has limited liability and the general partner has unlimited liability. Okay? What that general partner gets, though, with that unlimited liability is they can make all the day-to-day decision making. So you see this oftentimes if there are investors. So maybe there are off-farm investors. Maybe there are some investors in your agritourism operation that are in New York City or Chicago or wherever. And they don't want to be involved in the day-to-day decision-making of your corn maze or your pick your own, right? You're the one that's making the management decision. So what you get is you as a general partner would have that unlimited personal liability. What they would get is the limited partnership. Now you as a general partner could also be an LLC or a corporation. So you would actually have that limitation of the liability within that LP or the LLP, okay? Another mechanism that you see limited partnerships is with the estate tax. And I do not want to get into the weeds of the estate tax. The reality is the estate tax limit is quite high right now, and that could differ in the future. But layers of business entities, and a way to add a layer is to add a limited partnership, actually reduces the value of the land for estate tax purposes, okay? So this is an advanced estate planning maneuver. It's something to keep in mind in your back pocket. As far as limited partnerships are concerned, there are filing requirements. That filing fee does change a little bit from state to state, and it must be filed by the general partners itself. With a general partnership agreement, with general partnerships, it is not required that you have a partnership agreement, but I certainly advise all of my clients to get something in writing. On the flip side, with limited partnerships, it does require a limited partnership agreement. These are critically important for all types of partnerships, but is actually a requirement for limited partnerships. So some of the things that the partnership agreement will delve into would be the identification of the ownership units of each limited and general partner, any capital contribution of each of the partners, how profits and losses will be divided, what are their responsibilities, duties, and restrictions for each of the limited and even the general partners. So as I mentioned before, limited partnerships could be a helpful succession planning and even an estate planning tool, in addition to a way to have investors who are involved with that limited liability. All right, let's go ahead and move on to corporations. So with corporations, every owner or shareholder, as we call them in corporations, is given liability protection so long as the corporation is properly capitalized and adheres to formality requirements. So we call this the corporate shield. If you guys could visualize literally a shield in front of the business, like a big piece of armor, that's the corporate shield. And so debtors could be like, sorry, I just watched Game of Thrones. I'm thinking about the Army of the Dead. But if you could think about something with like a bow and arrow, right, trying to pierce the corporate shield, all right? But they cannot do that if the corporation is properly capitalized and it adheres to corporate formalities. What are corporate formalities? These would be things like bylaws, shareholder minutes, officer meetings, things like that whatever the requirements are in your state, whatever the requirements that are set forth in the bylaws, these are the things that corporations need to adhere to. More often than not, my clients are not adhering to corporate formalities properly. Now, simply because you miss one shareholder meeting does not necessarily mean that the corporate shield is going to be pierced. But over time, if you do have a disregard to corporate formalities, the court could, in its discretion, pierce the corporate shield. Now, there are different types of corporations for tax purposes. And people ask me all the time, like, which is better, a C Corp or an S Corp or an LLC? And the thing is that an LLC can also be taxed as either a C Corp or an S Corp. So both corporations and LLCs have the ability to choose how you're taxed. C Corps are taxed as a corporation. Essentially, there's some double taxation that's taking place. The advantage is, and I'm sure you're probably thinking, why in the world would I want to pay more in tax? Well, the advantage is that that this could be used as a publicly traded company. So if you have any thought that that one day your business is going to be publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, or if you want different classes of shareholders, or if you want even more than 75 shareholders, then you need to be considering a C corporation. The S corporation is what I recommend to most of my clients. I'm an S corporation. It is pass-through tax for shareholders. But it does require, in most states, and this is a New York threshold on the 75 or fewer, and the law could differ in your particular state, but it requires 75 or fewer shareholders who are natural persons, and only one class of stock. So that's important here when we are talking about the different, how you could layer different entities, right? So in this situation, the owner of the corporation, if it is an S Corp, it can't be an LLC or a not-for-profit corp or a trust. It has to be people. And if you are also wanting to have investors that have a different class of stock, then that's whenever you would use a C Corp versus an S Corp. A B Corp is sort of a trendy, charitable, for-profit entity that's working for the public benefit. So I do see this sometimes in production agriculture if there's really an educational component that's taking place there. So the filing requirements do vary from state to state. A common question that I get would be like, what are the advantages of filing in Delaware versus New York? Well, the filing requirements itself, as far as the filing fee, is going to differ a little bit from state to state. If you've got a choice among different states, it's something to look into, but there's probably not much disparity. You're likely looking at a couple $100 depending on the state on where you're going to file with. With limited liability companies in New York, there's a publication requirement. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But you don't see that same publication requirement with corporations. So there are some various internal documents with corporations, specifically bylaws. You're going to want to definitely have a set of bylaws that discuss the internal governance, and then also get that shareholder agreement and get those minutes done. So the shareholder minutes, etc. All right, moving on to limited liability companies. What I love about limited liability companies, and to back up, I've gotten out of my dress code, okay? So sole proprietorships, t-shirts and jeans. Partnerships, I'm trying to think about the dress code on this. This might be like a skirt and a shirt, or like some khaki riatas and a cowboy boot and some shirts, something like that. You're not really dressed up, but it's more casual. A corporation is going to be like suit and tie, dressed to the nines. And dress code wise, a limited liability is like business casual. For some people, it's the best of both worlds. For other people, it doesn't give them, the same formalities that they would prefer. So this is the dress code analogy is a simplistic way to look at it, but it is a nice way to sort of present the styles in the different entities. So LLCs, business casual, it's a hybrid, right? It's a hybrid between corporations and partnerships. And as I just noted, you get to decide how you want to be taxed, C Corp or S Corp. Now, the owners of an LLC are not called a shareholder. They are called a member, okay? And you can choose in most states on whether or not your LLC will be member managed or manager managed. So you could pick a person to be in charge of those day-to-day operations, or you can put the onus of that management in the members itself. And again, LLCs have the exact same corporate shield that corporations do, so long as they adhere to corporate formalities and are properly capitalized. As far as the filing requirements go, you file the articles of organization, not the articles of incorporation, with the Secretary of State. And the filing fee for that is likely going to be slightly higher depending on what state you are. Like I know in New York, it's slightly higher for an LLC versus a corporation. I believe it's also slightly higher in Illinois. Please don't quote me on that. And so in some states, it might be cheaper. It's worth a cross comparison whenever you're deciding what legal entity you're going to form. But the reality is that when you're talking about a couple $100, it's way better to decide the best legal entity for you than to try to figure out a way to save $50. Okay, so the internal documents that are included with an LLC would be things like an operating agreement and, of course, meeting minutes. A brief word on corporate formalities, because I'm pretty big into this. So I give my clients corporate books, and I try to also give them forms so they can do the minutes and things on their own. But I'm going to be honest with you. I really believe that most of my clients and most of the other ag operations that are out there aren't necessarily getting those corporate formalities up to date like they should. And so you really, as an entrepreneur, need to be on yourself about this. You need to calendar this. One thing that Rincker Law is starting to offer is like we're trying to send our clients reminders of their annual meetings and to even host them over the phone. We'll take the minutes and we'll write it up. And you don't necessarily have to work with your attorney, but you need to treat those corporate formalities as your administrative overhead. You have to do this in order to have that corporate shield. It's just a matter of getting through those formality requirements and trying to not ignore them. So again, Piercing the corporate veil is an important issue here with both LLCs and also corporations. And courts can pierce, they can bust through that shield if you are grossly undercapitalized. There's a flagrant disregard for corporate formality. So you didn't just miss one meeting, you missed a lot of meeting minutes. And the owners treat the corporation as their alter ego. So one of the things I really recommend to my clients is to get a separate bank account, but then to also make sure that the business doesn't pay for your personal assets. So, I'm going to give you an example. So like my law firm pays for my cell phone, and that's fine. That's totally fine. It's fine for your farm. They'll probably pay for your cell phone as long as you're using it for farm business, or the same thing with your agritourism. But it's not okay for my law firm to pay for my cable bill or my Netflix, right? Or my Hulu, right? Those are personal expenses. And one time I was giving a deposition, I'm laughing because this divorce was just such a mess. But I was deposing a husband in a divorce. So we were talking about his business expenses. And he was telling me that his business paid for his clothes. And that is not a valid expense. Although perhaps in production agriculture, if there are things like uniforms with your agritourism, then that most certainly is the case. But your agritourism operation should not be funding your dresses for your night out. And so a court would say that you are mixing your business and your personal funds, and you're treating the corporation as the alter ego of yourself. So my advice is to try to keep that corporate shield strong. I mean, why go through all this effort to form a corporate entity if you're not even going to pay attention to those corporate formalities? So are you up to date? Perhaps work with your attorney, take everything in there and see, like, what am I missing? It's okay to go in backwards and fill in the holes, or have some extra meetings to make up for some things that you perhaps have missed. And to check, have you properly complied with the formation requirements pursuant to, 1, the law in your state, whether it's New York or wherever, and then 2, whatever your internal operating documents are, your operating agreement or your bylaws. Look at what's required there. Perhaps your bylaws say that you're going to have an annual shareholder meeting on the third Tuesday in March of every year. So by golly, go back and check if you did that. If you're missing 3 years, then you need to go in and fill in those holes. And you need to make a concerted effort to fix it going forward. When do you need to be sending out notices? How are you going to be having this meeting? Are you going to work with your attorney on getting it scheduled? Some other thoughts on keeping the corporate shield. Keep those personal assets of the corporation or the LLC separate. Don't commingle assets. I think separate bank accounts is really important to this. I really like using checks. I really hate whenever my finances get mixed up. For example, right now I have Uber hooked up to my Rincker Law PayPal account. And not all my Ubers are for work. I mean, sometimes I'm just meeting friends and it's for personal travel. And if that's the case, then I need to be reimbursing my business. Similarly, if I'm using my personal bank card or credit card for a business expense, and I've done this very recently with art. Okay, so I've bought some art for my law practice. My company is reimbursing me. You better put in the memorandum exactly what it's for, because you don't want to be dealing with an IRS audit, or worse, dealing with the court system on why your business was writing all these miscellaneous checks to yourself. So keep your bookkeeping clear. Put contracts and the title of the corporation and LLC property in the business name, and keep those personal assets separate. Let's move on briefly to cooperatives. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just generally speaking, cooperatives are in some ways a lot like a corporation. In other ways, they're very democratic. Okay, so Cooperatives are formed for the mutual benefit of the members, and usually cooperatives are formed so that members may procure goods and services on a collective basis or market their products through a group activity. And as I mentioned, cooperatives tend to be democratic because one member, one vote, or they use some type of proportional voting system. So like corporations, they too are managed by a board of directors and elected by the members. There is usually a filing fee that's associated with this along the same lines as a not-for-profit entity. Articles of organization in New York, I believe, are about $100 for a filing fee. I also want to briefly touch about trusts that could be used as another form of a business entity. I really like trusts to own the land. I think it's a great mechanism to own the real property, and perhaps a different business entity like an LLC or a corporation can run the agritourism operating company. So perhaps the land is owned by the trust. Let's say an LLC owns the agritourism operation. So it owns the farm equipment, it owns the livestock, it owns the food enterprise, and perhaps there's even another entity or a partnership between the trust and the agritourism. So that is another option here on how to fit in trusts in the process. So I like trusts because they are a way to avoid probate, and that has a few advantages in and of itself. So avoiding probate, especially with land involved in federal farm programs, can be a big advantage because farmland that's held up in probate can have some issues with some federal farm programs. So land that avoids probate is instantaneous. And the second big advantage to that is that it's private. So, I have mixed views about this. I like the privacy aspect of things. I would tell you that most people, when I talk to with production agriculture, they also like the privacy. They don't want the whole small town or county clerk, knowing about what they do and who they're giving what to and all of those things. Other people don't care. They're like, I'm dead. Why would I care? So this is a personal decision for you. There are two basic kinds of trusts, revocable and irrevocable, and they are just exactly what the word describes. Revocable trusts can be revoked or modified. An irrevocable trust are indelible. They cannot be modified. And why would you want to have an irrevocable trust? You'd want to use it in circumstances such as Medicaid planning. And I always sometimes get mixed up with Medicaid and Medicare. And so there's a memory tool that I've learned of Medicaid, public aid, Medicare, silver hair. But with Medicaid planning, there's a 7-year look back period there. So when you're moving your farmland into an irrevocable trust, let's say about 10 years before you go into a nursing home, then that asset can be shielded if you are going to go onto Medicaid. So I really don't have these conversations with people when they're in their youth or in the middle of their life. But, when people are entering more towards retirement and they're inching, depending on their health, towards perhaps being in a nursing home, then that's when these conversations become very real. Another example in production agriculture with using a revocable living trust would be with a farm family who wants to give their child livestock, land, or cash property, and you could do this with a form of using a trust. And this particular client wanted to have graduated control, so a third of the trust would go to the child when he or she was 22, a third whenever he or she reached the age of 26, and then the final third when he or she reached the age of 30. you're going to be able to tell how financially responsible your child is when he or she gets to be of age. And with a revocable living trust, you can change it at any time, right? That's the advantage of using that. And so another example of a revocable living trust is when grandparents put the farmland in a revocable living trust. The grandparents in that scenario are trustees. The children are the beneficiaries of the trust, and the grandchildren are the contingent beneficiaries. Like an LLC or a corporation, trusts do have to maintain various formalities. One big advantage with trust, as I mentioned, is that it passes by operation of law and avoids probate. So quickly, here are some specialized trusts, such as testamentary trusts. I think pretty much everybody who has minor children below the age of 18, you need to have a testamentary trust set up in your last will and testament if you do not already have a revocable living trust. Credit shelter trusts, generation skipping trusts, and pet trusts, which can be formed for companion animals, even including horses, are other forms of trust to consider. I actually also have some more information on pet trusts on my website, rinkerlaw.com, if you're interested in learning more about it. So the last form of business entities that I'm going to mention that affect agritourism are not-for-profit corporations. So a not-for-profit corporation doesn't mean that the entity doesn't make profit. Its profit is just not distributed with the shareholders or the owners. So not-for-profit entities can pay salaries to its employees just like a for-profit business. There are restrictions and oversight on how that money can be spent. Corporate formalities are similar with not-for-profit corporations as for-profit corporations. You must also comply with the federal tax code. Like for-profit corporations, they also need to have bylaws. So here are some examples of how this could be used in agritourism. Would be things like with farmers markets, or as I mentioned, with educational activities on your farm. So I'll give you an example of that. There's a rooftop farm in Brooklyn, and the farm itself, I think, is a corporation. It might be an LLC. I don't really remember. But they also had a foundation, an educational foundation, where this particular person would give tours to school kids, and they would learn about gardening and rooftop farming. And I even went to this particular rooftop farm through New York Agritourism. And so this person set up a not-for-profit corporation so he or she could accept donations and do different types of charitable activities through its not-for-profit. Now, with tax exempt status, this is sort of a step 2 in a 2-step process. So step 1 is forming the corporation, much like how you would form a for-profit entity. And then step 2 is dealing with the IRS. So I think a lot of times not-for-profit groups think as soon as they file for the not-for-profit, then they're done and they're a 501c3, and that's not the case. So that's step 1. And second of all, not all not-for-profits are even eligible for a 501c3. That's a very specific kind of a not-for-profit, which is a charitable organization. A lot of agriculture not-for-profits are going to be 501c4, 501c5s. So unless you are a charitable organization, you're likely looking at the 501c4 or 5 category. And I also have some of the language here within the slides. So I just ask that you look it over and definitely talk to your attorney if you have any questions on eligibility there with a not-for-profit. So as I mentioned before, I'm the founding member of New York Agritourism, and we had visited the rooftop farm there in Brooklyn. Its purpose is threefold. Its purpose is to educate fellow agriculture community, educate consumers, and also to educate elected officials. So the question that I pose for the listeners is, was New York Agri-Women or is New York Agri-Women eligible for 501c3 status? So the answer is no. And New York Agri-Women, I believe, is a 501c5 or 501c4. So 501c4 is for civic organizations and 501c5 is for agricultural organizations, but they would have been eligible for either one of those. But 501c3s would be things like churches and groups where education is its primary purpose. Another option would be 501c6, which is a business league exemption. You see this with the chambers of commerce, so on and so forth. So, all right, let's go into insurance. I know that we spent the big chunk of the presentation sort of breaking down the business entities, and to be honest with you, I think that this is the biggest part of how you can mitigate risk with your agritourism operation. So with insurance, something to keep in mind that an insurance is really a contract. It's a contract between the insurance company and the insured, right? And there's an obligation of the insurance company, which is to indemnify the insured against liability claims made in the event from which the liability of the insured arose was the type of event covered in the policy, right? So it has to be from the type of things that are covered, like hail or rain or tornado, and your insurance might not be covered for hurricanes and flood. I mean, I don't know. So the type of event is important to observe. And then two, there's a duty to defend the insurance. So long as you sort of fit in that type of event that's covered, then the insurance company must defend, including paying attorney's fees, court costs, etc., with resolving that disputes. All right, so there's also obligations, like any contract, for the other side. So there's obligations for the insured. The insured has to pay premiums. There is a duty to cooperate with the insurance company to defend any claims. The duty to give prompt notice of claims, promptly notify the insurance company of any actual or potential claims that are taking place. And there are so many kinds of insurance. It can become overwhelming. This next slide lists a laundry list of a bunch of different kinds of insurance. For the sake of time, I'm not going to break them all down one by one. I hope that you will spend the time, look at this PowerPoint presentation, and I also have similar presentations that are posted on slideshare.com that will delve into more information. A lot of these materials were also discussed in a CLE that I gave for the American Bar Association General Practice and Solo and Small Firm on local food law, and I also gave a similar presentation on law line. So if I'm skipping through this section on the types of insurance and you're looking for more information, I would definitely reach out to those resources as well. The big one is the farm owner's comprehensive liability insurance policy. And, this is going to basically be your property liability insurance. And so some general exclusions, there's an important one that's on this list, includes agritourism. So it's really important for the listeners here to have candid conversations with the insurance company and say, hey, listen, this is everything that my farm does. What is covered on this insurance? What else do I need here to help fill on the gaps? If I'm doing a corn maze, if I'm doing a pick your own, if I'm doing, a pumpkin patch, whatever it is that you're doing, or a farm stay, like what do you need to do to help you with that additional liability risk, okay? Importantly, with homeowners insurance and renters insurance, is that these do not cover business activities. So I use the example of people making jams and jellies out of their kitchen. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but that activity is actually not covered under your homeowners or renters insurance because that is a commercial activity. So you would actually need, next slide, commercial insurance in order to cover those types of activities. So what you need for your agritourism operation is going to be different than the next person who's listening here to this virtual presentation. And what's really important, if you get nothing else out of this presentation, is that you need to have a business entity and you need to have insurance that's specifically tailored for you and your needs. Okay? Food insurance may or may not be an issue for you depending on how much food, specifically raw foods or processed foods, that you are selling to your visitors. Crop insurance may or may not be an issue for your particular operation. Livestock insurance, like crop insurance, there's private livestock insurance, but there's also federally reinsured livestock insurance under the USDA umbrella with the Risk Management Agency, or RMA. Equine insurance is something to also consider. I mean, are you having trail rides? Are you giving horseback riding lessons? Are there any equine activities that are taking place on your agritourism operation? And what is or is not covered, on those insurance policies? Undoubtedly, you're going to need vehicle insurance, but you also need to think about, again, like what is and what is not covered in with your vehicle insurance. In my own operation, and by the way, I do actually have a farm in Illinois. I have some goats, and chickens, and rabbits, and some cattle, and so on and so forth. I'm wondering if for 2 years, when I drove my Jeep around, on whether or not I was even covered for any commercial activities. I now have a truck, but it's something that now I'm thinking that I need to look into to make sure that I have proper coverage for commercial activities. Like if I'm transporting goats around in my truck and I get in a truck accident and I lose some very expensive or not so expensive goats in my truck, is that considered some part of the property damage? Workman's compensation insurance should certainly be considered if you have employees, and business insurance, environmental insurance, and even cyber insurance should also be considered. A word on umbrella policies. I hate this word because it is so confusing for people. I feel like when my clients come to me and they'll say things like, oh, I have a $2 million umbrella policy, I'm good. I feel like they believe that if they have an umbrella policy, that the umbrella policy fills in all the gaps. Remember how we were talking about how agritourism is an exception to the general property insurance? Well, that gap, if there is any gap, is not going to be filled in by umbrella insurance. Instead, you need to think about umbrella policies as being a top hat to your existing coverages. So everything that you do have, it increases the limits, but it is not going to fill in the goal. And finally, and then we'll move on to another concept here on mitigating risk, is have candid conversations with your insurance company on special agritourism riders. A rider should be obtained for things like a petting zoo, corn maze, farm tours, or festivals, and the premiums will be affected primarily by the type of activity that you are implementing into your agritourism or agri-tainment operations. Activities that involve horseback riding can be implemented with an equine-specific policy, as I just noted a few slides ago. Moving on very quickly to general releases. I know we're skipping around on these topics and we're not really delving into them in too much detail. So I hope that each of you will take some time to speak with an attorney that you have a working relationship with. It's something that's very important to me. Is I feel like every farm, food entrepreneur, agribusiness owner needs to have that go-to person in their life that they could talk to from day 1 or day 20 or day 240. I don't know what day you're on. To be a team player in their operation to help prevent big problems before they exist. Last month I was on vacation in Hawaii, and I heard from a farmer that I honestly haven't talked to for about 10 years. He's not a client, and of course there was an emergency. It's very difficult for me to come in the middle of an emergency, but if I'm there from the very beginning and the onset, I can prevent those emergencies from ever taking place. So getting back to general releases. So the thing is with general releases is they are good to do. They're good to post these rules and warnings for people. You can even have them sign off on waivers and things, but their strength is going to be different from state to state. Okay, I just wanted to make that very important point, that simply because you're posting these warnings online or on your farm or having people sign off on things doesn't mean that your farm is not liable. Okay, but you could post things such as not consuming alcoholic beverages or no smoking, saying that this is a working farm, be careful because of animals or dogs, caution, electric fence, please no swimming in the pond, do not touch the animals, they may bite, do not feed the animals, do not enter. We've all seen those types of signs. And then the general releases. New York, for example, is a strict liability state. Do I have New York clients using general releases? Yes. Are they bulletproof? No. But are there something that farms and agritourism operations should consider? Absolutely. Contracts can be another great device for mitigating risk. Trying to get those contracts in writing, including leases. Think about indemnification clause and other mechanisms to shift risks to vendors. And finally, as I mentioned, work with an attorney that you feel comfortable with. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to really be delving into employment law issues. This in and of itself can be an entire law lecture, but think about the following issues. Do you have volunteer or unpaid farm labor? If the answer is yes, then you really should be thinking that through and speaking to a legal professional. And if everybody on your farm is not considered an employee, if you are working with people that you consider to be an independent contractor, are they 1099? Then you need to probably be consulting with an employment lawyer to make sure that you're getting these classifications correct. Are you paying any of your workers an in-kind compensation? Are you giving them vegetables instead of a paycheck or part of a paycheck? If the answer is yes, please consult with an employment or an agricultural lawyer. Think about employment handbooks. Think about non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements. I have some more information available on all of these topics and more in my book, The Legal Guide for New York Farmers and Food Entrepreneurs, a field manual that is available on Amazon, Kindle, and I think iBooks. And here's my contact information. You can certainly reach out. I fly back and forth between New York and Illinois. I can meet you in my office in Midtown, or you can reach out to me at a myriad of social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and I even have a YouTube channel at my own. My social media handle is just my name, Cari, Cari, Rincker, Rincker. So without further ado, I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the virtual conference. Thanks again.